solo di ascoltare.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce you the two speakers of today, David Adamson and Adam Loch. This is the last seminar, kind of final seminar on the series we had on water and climate change. In this case, we're going to talk about the transferability of economic instruments to mitigate drought or other water scarcity impacts. As I said before, I have here today with me two distinguished speakers. First of all, we'll start the presentation with Adam Loch from the University of Adelaide. He's an ARC DECRA Fellow. He's a Senior Researcher at the same university and the University of Adelaide. He will provide an overview together with David Adamson, who I'm going to introduce now, on what are the economic instruments that we have at hand to manage water in situations of scarcity and drought. Then David will step in. David is also an ARC Fellow in the University of Queensland. He came here last year in October. He did his ARC DECRA Fellow while he was here, so now we are looking forward to seeing what he's going to receive next, as he's now that he has come here again. So without further ado, I'm going to leave Alan start the presentation that he has prepared for the seminar. Well, I also would like to remind all of you that you can make questions at any time during the presentation. I will read them at the end of the presentation once the speakers have finished, in order to avoid interrupting them, and they will answer the questions. So feel free to make the questions at any time of the presentation that you deem better. Without further ado, please.
Okay. Thanks, Gianni. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So good. Now, thanks, Gianni. So I think it's really very nice to be here. There's no doubt about it. And importantly, we've got to really recognize the people who allowed this to happen from our point of view. It's very nice to... this one? Okay. Is that better?
Is that better? The headphones. These are the headphones.
Okay, just that. Sorry.
Yeah,
we need to
really recognise the people who
the funding
that managed to get here. So
David,
in my point of view,
special thanks
to the Australian Research Council,
who provide us with the DECRA funding, but
also
the University of Queensland, my own university,
Adelaide,
and where I used to come
from, the University of Australia,
who also provide us with
some.
So I might hand back to David to start off with this one on water scarcity and welfare,
and I'll pick it up from there.
Right, thank you, Adam. All right, one thing we know when playing around with water scarcity is its impact on society. It's, and I'm sorry people, just got to get used to this new system. Right. So it's the benefits of jumping to constraints. What we do know is when we have water, what happens when we have an inequitable share of water resources, we suffer from welfare loss, both not only economic activity, but social activities and environmental harm. As our water scarcity increases, we run the risk of creating irreversible losses with this inequity. And what happens in that sort of situation is that suddenly we run out of water to share between everyone, and quite often we've experienced in the past that the environment is one of the biggest losses, followed by society and then eventually agriculture. What we do know in Australia is we're expecting climate change to alter both the total amount of water available and the intensity and severity of droughts. And pretty much what we're talking about in this little conversation is we are going to get less water, and this may be quite severe in certain situations. What we're starting to play around with far more in society is how we use economic instruments. Economic instruments are designed to influence the behaviour of individuals within society. These are really designed to help capture the inequalities and externalities we have from consumptive water use. And what we do find is that water, especially in very scarce environments, has a few special features when it comes to talking about economic instruments.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah. So I think what we might do then is start where lots of no, is it back to me? Sorry. Okay. What we might do is start with where lots of people start, which is with public instruments to deal with the unique properties of water. And what we typically find is that you're going to start to see a requirement for protection against drought for irrigation systems in particular. The reality around the world is that 70, 80, maybe even as much as 90% of freshwater resources are by irrigators. And of course they're the ones who tend to get a little upset when water isn't as reliable as it used to be. So we typically are going to see big engineering, hard engineering solutions for supply and delivery and reliability for these systems, usually as instruments that are used to give us some security against drought. Might also see some compensatory arrangements, economic, social, or environmental. I think most of us might be familiar with drought support, so this could be low interest loans, could be payments to farmers or irrigators or other people who are drought affected. Industry might get involved whenever water gets low. We might see an ongoing system of support for various people as long as that drought continues and maybe even after the event. This, of course, also maybe gets us thinking about efficiency and we might use it better and government can get involved in providing some incentives there from supply and demand point of views. And we might eventually move towards more legislative planning arrangements for instruments that again are designed to try and adapt people's either demand or possibly supply to this changing environment. There may be more legislative and planning issues around quality where algal blooms, salinity, or black water events and low oxygen start to impact on other arrangements, giving us some negative externalities. And we might even say to ourselves that we really need to claw back resources more generally through legislative and planning arrangements to see if we can get some water into the system.
Right, thank you. The second step really is the link between government policy and institutions. And hang on, sorry.
We're on? Yep, okay. That second link between how we take government policy of command and control towards the private individuals. There are two main ways we normally internalise externalities. One is via the adoption of property rights and taxation policy. There are fundamental differences though. Property rights really helps us define the total supply of water that's available to be used, and taxes really go around charging people for how you use that water. Provided you have the money to pay, you can keep using water, and therefore you don't really reduce the amount that's being used. What we started doing in Australia back in the 80s is we started unbundling our rights package. So we started unbundling the water from the land. That gave people a lot of abilities then to start heading towards a market-based structure. What we also find with our instruments and institutions is we start setting up who can trade with whom, where we can move this water from one area to another. Can we trade between surface and groundwater? Can we introduce new supports, new supplies of water from conjunctive water resources? Can we transfer water in from different basins? These are very important aspects that not only institutions need to deal with, but also people need to understand. What we find at our institutions as well, we start defining our social goals. What do we want water quality to be? Where do we want minimum water flows to be? How much water do we want to give the environment and why? How do we get that there in drought times versus times of plenty? And we have to do this. We need to set up a whole variety of supporting programs. Not only things like salinity, but how we deal with natural resource management programs altogether. But the more often we start playing with these institutions and changing them, we introduce a series of transaction costs associated with the transfer of one mechanism to another. These cost society money. We need to be very careful about how we introduce these things and the rate at which we rapidly change water reform. And I'll hand back to Adam.
I think I've got it right this time. So the flip side to all of these public instruments is obviously when we want to give ourselves some private incentives. And there's a whole range of things that we often talk about here, and a lot of these are very close to my heart, particularly in my research. Insurance, I think something far more experienced here in Europe, not as experienced in Australia, but we certainly do have some arrangements in place for crop insurance, maybe hail damage insurance, and my understanding is, interestingly, that there is a developing market for drought insurance in Australia as we speak. There's obviously trade. This is by far and away my favourite personally, where you're really shifting the basis of risk management back to individuals. You're moving away from a command and control. Government knows all. Government is the font of all knowledge, towards private rights and at the margin. Then we got efficiency, which we've discussed a couple of times as well. If users are particularly interested in valuing the water and they think it's worthwhile, they'll invest in protecting that and mitigating their risk in that way. The other thing is water charges. So increasingly where I think you find the privatisation of supply networks where they're handed away from government, as has been the case in Australia, obviously then the charges are going to be put in place that reflect the costs of operating those. And in Australia it's a full cost recovery ideal, not necessarily always achieved, but it's certainly the ideal. And finally here, maybe voluntary agreements are something we shouldn't forget about, where users, for a range of reasons, will come together and they'll understand the need for quality or use reasons to really reach an agreement, maybe informal or formal arrangements to deal with stuff. And so we talk a little bit about that later on as well.
Oops, we have just lost the picture there. Okay, and then despite setting up all these markets and institutions and private access, what we suddenly realised is there's market failure. You'd think after we've been doing economics for so long that market failure would be right up there with the front. What we quickly realised though is when you establish these sort of things, you make mistakes, and you need to be honest about that. Australia is definitely not a perfect system when it comes to water reform. One of the big things we missed when we were setting up this water reform process was the fact we didn't consider underutilised and undeveloped water rights. Suddenly, by defining a total supply of water, these underutilised rights had great value to other people. We missed an opportunity then to claw back these resources at very minimal cost. And suddenly we're now spending an enormous amount of money buying back these water resources or investing in water use efficiency programs to develop common property rights for the environment. What you find in the situation here in Australia is the environment now has a set of rights which has the same value as private rights, and they've either been bought back from irrigators who are willing to sell to the government, or have come back from water use efficiency programs, either directly on-farm investments or investments in environmental assets where we've designed new infrastructure to get water back to the environment more efficiently and more effectively. And we're starting to play a lot more around with ecosystem services. How do we value those ecosystem services so that irrigators are willing to participate in this sort of area? I think one thing we must always remember when it comes to irrigation is that it was initially designed to offset climate risk. And it was initially done at a very low value to farmers, so it was very cheap. Now we're dealing with far more market-based systems where they're now appreciating the value of that water and that asset and what it means to their asset values. And then I think we're into questions. So back to the moderator.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. We have many people today with us here. I will unmute Adam because then I forget. We have many participants here today with us, so I'm sure we will start to receive questions from them soon. Usually it takes some time. So I will start with your questions, if you don't mind. I will check first if you have received. No. Okay. So yeah, you have been talking about many instruments. Yeah, I'm wondering what's the experience with these instruments in Australia. In some cases, I'm more familiar with them. In the case of insurance, I haven't really heard much about how the insurance market in Australia is performing. But I would like to start with trading, obviously. So you have mentioned that trading, obviously trading is a very good instrument to reveal the value of water, but I am more concerned about how the costs are internalized for the people who are trading. So you have also mentioned before charges. You have mentioned also that full cost recovery is a goal in Australian water policy. So I was wondering to what extent the gap between the benefits and costs that you can make in trading reflects the true cost of water and the true value of water, if there is such a, maybe true is a very strong word. But I'm trying to understand if the way water is managed in Australia is fair from the point of view that if it's revealing the cost to the people who are making profit out of that water.
So if I
understand, you're saying you really want to understand if the benefits of trade, in other words, all this investment we've made, is benefiting them, or they're reflecting.
Yeah, I'm sure they are getting some benefits, but the question will be, because here, for example, in Europe, the level of cost recovery is very low. So if after making all this investment to make trade work, which is a very good solution, I was wondering if they are making some kind of rent extraction out of all of this. So if they are taking some benefits, some advantages out of this investment from the government, or if the government is making them pay for the money that they have spent up to this point.
Okay. So there's a couple of things that I would throw in to respond to that. The cost recovery is probably more about operating the infrastructure. But having said that, the trade systems have been arranged and they've been organised so that the transaction cost of trade for irrigators is coming down over time. So it's not been sort of deliberately set up so that cost of trade would be recovered by their charges for trade. In fact, I think most Australia would operate on a non-profit basis. Okay. So no, I don't think irrigation systems would be profiting from trade as such. The other thing I want to talk about is the benefits of trade. So particularly during drought, when we had the ability to trade in place, you're talking billions of dollars worth of benefit from being able to shift the water away from crops that we didn't want to grow necessarily at the time rice. You can move it back into the perennial crops, grapes, trees that were really adapted to survive through the drought itself. And I think there were some estimates at the time that if we hadn't had the market in place, those benefits would have been somewhere in the order of about $1.6 billion less than what we experienced. So we had about, from memory, we had about a 30% reduction in water availability. We only suffered, I think, about a 10%. Oh no, we had more than 70%. Sorry, 70% less water. We suffered about a 10 to 20% reduction in the gross value of irrigated agricultural production because of the markets.
Yeah, that's about right. When you're actually trading water, what you normally do is you go through water broker, say like water fund, and therefore you're paying a fixed fee per transaction, either when you're in the temporary market or the permanent market. But as an individual, leave your as activity, you then have to pay a fixed cost back to the infrastructure holder. So if you want to leave, you've got to pay some money. You want to engage in trade, it's just a big transaction like a service fee. So it's really quite cheap for farmers to actually engage in the trading system.
Yeah, two distinct types. So there's sort of temporary trade, which is in real terms is very cheap. It's not very expensive, particularly when you do it within a particular zone. Then it's almost costless in reality. And if you do it, say, between zones using a broker, I think the usual cost is about 3% of the value of the trade. Permanent trade, entitled, really selling that right forever. I'm done. I'm getting out of this asset. That's a lot more expensive. Takes a lot longer. Can take months in reality. And can be very costly with lawyers. We're familiar with that probably in places like Spain and elsewhere. But within season annual trade, very cheap in some respects.
Quick too. Hiring a car versus selling a house.
Okay, yeah, well, excellent answer. Very precise. I made no question because I said that we didn't have any questions. Actually, we have a huge amount of questions and that we need to answer. Because I didn't know the reason is that I didn't know where to find them. In case you haven't realized, this is my first time as a moderator using in the ICCG series. Yeah, my bad. So first question, very much repeated, regarding transferability. So the people following the presentation would like to know which are the preconditions and how strong control efforts have been in Australia. What are the preconditions for trading? How strong have been the efforts to control, I guess, the amount of water allotted and the amount of water that is traded. Well, in this case, they talk about the Spanish and Italian case particularly. How are the possibilities to transfer the experience with water markets in Australia to Spain, and what are the preconditions that you could highlight? Yeah.
The transferability, I think, is both good and bad. Sorry to hedge like that. I think there's a lot of similarities, particularly between Spain and Australia, which I find really interesting in my limited understanding of that context. Italy, I'm looking forward to learning more about that in the next week or two. Venture out tomorrow and next week. But in reality, all institutions are different, all contexts are different, all of the users are different. So we suffer the same issues, but we're very different. It would be extremely remiss of me to come here and to say, hey, we've got the solution in Australia. You guys need to listen up because hands down, this is the way. That's just nonsense, and it just doesn't transfer that easily. However, there's definitely lessons to be learned from one another, from our view coming back as much as coming over here and talking to you guys. So it really is a difficult one to answer, other than to say it's not easy, but it's possible. It is possible.
I mean, it was already a slow process for us to start establishing water trade. We eventually had to have what Adam described as the Millennium Drought, which is the worst drought in Australia, that forced both state and federal governments together. Yeah, to go through and actually say, right, enough's enough, we deal with the situation. Suddenly we started breaking barriers to trade, decoupling water rights. We're still going through some of that process. We're not perfect, but it's a lot easier these days for an individual farmer to actually engage in the market. And as Adam said, saved during the Millennium Drought. It really did.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up now two questions from Pelum Haridjat. He asked us about the role that ecologists may have, how ecologists interact with economists in the development and implementation of economic instruments. And then he makes another question regarding, which is quite closely connected to the first one, in which he says whether or not we are aware of the role that health ecosystems may have in solving water problems, which is connected to the role of, I guess, green infrastructures. But I would like to learn to know your answer to this particular question, especially with the first one, interaction with the government.
Well, we
still deal with evidence-based policy.
And what you find in that situation is we get information from ecologists and other scientists out there about what we consider to be the institutional goals. How much water do we need for different environmental assets? How often do they need to be watered? Water quality is required under the system. How much flows do you require? Then it's nice and easy. We don't have to work out these numbers and make assumptions. We now have numbers which we've got far more faith in, and then we can start doing it. For us, it's lovely. I can point to somebody else and blame them. It's a really nice feeling to get out of that situation instead of using pure assumptions. And so you can incorporate these sort of key requirements into your model and say, well, what does happen to this water by requirement back to these assets? And it's really been surprising when we do all the numbers that you can transfer a lot around, and by engaging in trade, overall you do lose money, but not as much as most people think in the first round.
I think the other thing we've discovered is that there was a lot of fear as markets were being developed, and as this idea of environmental or ecological flows was being developed, there was a lot of fear that trade would undermine the ecological system. But I think that by and large to date, at least, we've discovered that that's not been the case. So the two have really sat side by side, and they've worked quite well. Again, during the drought, you saw trade in respect of moving water down the system to provide ecological benefits, at least within the river stem. So it's not the two. I think they've been together for a long time. They sit very much.
One thing we realise when we started doing some of this stuff is some of the ecological benefits, environmental benefits, and production system benefits for irrigators downstream. This idea of determining environmental flows, some places that the water has gone across paddocks and stuff, so farmers have actually benefited by having pasture, which they weren't expecting to. And a lot of this stuff is coming by actually most of the time we've done.
Okay. Well, there is another answer that relates also, this mostly connected to this one, in which Flavio Gusto he mentions that whether or not we have considered, or economists have considered, the role that forestry may have in improving water management. I have picked up this one because actually we have started, one of our PhD students has started to work on the role that forestry has on aquifer recharge. Obviously, this happens in northeastern Italy, so it's quite a very different reality to the realities you may have in the maritime basin. So I don't know if forestry there plays any role, if there is some interaction between both ecosystems.
Well, give the Australian case. Once upon a time, our objective was to cut down all the trees. When you cut down all the trees, the water flow to the river actually increased. But so did salinity. So when you start talking about replanting vegetation, you're actually getting a greater interception of water going back to the river. And the other thing with trees is with the deep taproots, they can access water all the time. We did a paper a couple of years ago, effectively pointing this out, as we end up with the second round negative impact of climate change by investing in large-scale tree replanting. But that's not to say it shouldn't be done. In fact, there's many benefits associated with the river ecosystem by restoring vegetation back along there, so you prevent salinification and also sediment runoff back to the river systems, because they play a very important role.
Okay, so let's go to the next question, which regards applicability in the law. So we have many questions from the people who are following us, from many questions related to India, for example, in which drought has been an issue for the last 2 years. And they are asking if you have, if you can comment on the applicability of economic instruments, of some of them, I guess not all of them, but some of the economic instruments that you have presented in the case of a developing country. They talk about India, 2 or 3 of the people following us, but any other developing context, I guess, will work. How do you think that these are applicable? What are the prerequisites? Because I guess that monitoring is a big issue, for example, for water charges.
That's a really
good
question,
and one that's on my mind.
A bit of a plug.
We've got some UNESCO funding, and that's partly what I'm really interested to look at with that project is that it's all well and good for us in developed nations with good institutions to say, hey, this is possible. In the developing context, it's a much more difficult story, and so the institutional capacity is probably going to be a little bit more limited. India fascinates me as well with the caste system there and the ownership of water that can be, as I understand it anyway, far removed in some respects from the actual user. And so you have an additional level of property right complexity there to deal with. I suppose the short answer is that it all boils down to the institutions and how you frame those, how you sequentially put those in place. What you've got, obviously, existing in place at the moment, and identifying what may be missing and may need strengthening, or indeed putting in place from the start. So colleagues of mine in Adelaide, in Australia, we've been working on a framework where that's exactly what we want to do. We want to see just where are different contexts at in their development of markets, their ability to actually take them on board. So we've got a developed nation and a developing nation focus in the testing of that framework over the next 12 months or so. As part of what we're doing tomorrow and next week, Dione, and it's just to see how well that works.
Yeah. And I mean, these issues getting more complex. You start dealing with trans-boundary issues. You go like the Mekong River, dividing up an equitable share along that or even the Nile. I mean, it poses a lot of complex questions associated for government panels to work between troubles with Australia in one country.
Yeah, well, I guess this was more or less answered with your reply now, but they are asking, and this is also, this is also a question that I guess for in the case of Italy and Spain makes a lot of sense. So Guillaume Gruet asks about what type of measures you implemented in Australia, in the particular case of Australia, and also in the Murray-Darling Basin, I guess. He's talking about the Murray-Darling Basin indeed, to make farmers accept taking part in this trading system. And how do you make it? Because we have been talking about different applicability in other countries. Now they are asking. Perhaps I should have started. How do you make it in Australia? What was the process? Was it long?
It went on for a while. We're talking at least 20 years, if not more. Formal systems in the mid to late 80s. But the easiest way to motivate farmers to get involved was drought. A 10-year-long event that about midway through saw their access to water basically plummet to less than never seen before. It really did get motivated to engage. And I used to be a farmer. I was farming when trade was being done in Queensland, for example. And lots of people very worried about the change. Lots of people extremely concerned about how their rights would alter, how the nature of them might alter. It's scary stuff because it's new. So myself, I was pretty worried about what may or may not happen. But if you were to go back 20 years to say to farmers, we're going to bring in trade, they would have been very wary. If you were to go to them today and say, we're actually thinking about taking the trade away, they would just kill you. Having gone through the drought, those who've used it, if you were to say to them we're taking it, they would just lose it. Bigger than when we were talking about bringing it in.
it's really hard to actually understand the amount of water we didn't have when drought. I mean, when you sort of say you're getting only 30% what you used to, that's the people who are really lucky. A lot of people got none of their assets and to adjust while water in if you want your crops to survive. And you're willing to sell that water because it's worth a lot on the open market. And how they adapted and responded, how quickly they did it, was very surprising. I think it got a lot of guard just how well they adopted it.
I've spent a lot of time talking to farmers towards the end of the drought, not 30 or 40 50 or so, and a couple after the drought. They never cease to amaze me. Farmers are amazingly adaptive. You have to be. It's the nature of the game. And so I think too, when you see a couple of people in your community, for example, getting on board and running with it, it's amazing how the other people suddenly go, okay, so that's interesting. They're actually doing quite well at this. Maybe I need to have a think about this as well. Having said that, we did some research 4 or 5 years ago where we asked about 1,000 irrigators in the basin, their trading behaviour. And I was extremely surprised to find roughly 50% of them had never engaged in trade up till 2010. We've just gone back and redone that. I'm not familiar. It was in November. I'm not familiar with whether the percentage has changed. But it is a good question. Because even despite all of this, we still got half of the irrigators in the Maritime Basin to that point anyway had not had anything to do with it.
Yeah, but I mean that drought also doing the buyback. Farmers were rapidly wanting to sell because the government was offering high prices, so available on the open market. So having that little bit extra really motivate people.
Talking about that, there is another question that regards the definition of the rights in Australia, water property rights. Well, I assume the rights are defined in absolute way, so you have this amount of water, X cubic meters. Is there any intention or idea to define shares instead of, so a share of the water available, or is it already available now?
They are defined as shares. So rather than a volumetric set of arrangements, it's a share arrangement. So that everybody, in a sense, benefits or suffers equally.
We do have those rights in 3 levels. So there's a high security entitlement, general security, and then supplementary. Really only get flooding. So you say priority right association, but you rarely get a full amount.
Okay.
And you only really get full amount if it's very wet. And a lot of time people don't actually want the water there. But you're talking 30%. It was only the high security entitlements were getting 30%. The general were getting 0. And the supplementary were getting 0.
Okay.
But that's
the beauty of the share system in some respects, because nothing stays the same. Right? So a season starts and it changes. So as we get more information, as we get more water, as things change, the system changes. So you may open. And the high security people may be still sitting up around 95% of their share is being given to them. And then there's an inflow or systems updated. So now suddenly with a general security share I'm getting 10%, 20%. So it can ramp up through the year. And again, that's where markets are valuable, because you start with nothing, and then by the middle of it, suddenly you've got something to play with. Well, you're too late to plant cotton or rice or whatever, but it's not too late to sell, and you can still make some money by selling that. What you've been granted as your portion in that year on the open market gives you that income.
And ladies and gentlemen, that's yes.
True. I forgot to say that, but it's important. So next Monday we're going to have another seminar. In this case, it will be a seminar. It will be organized by theme, but you will be able to connect in any case as well through GoToMeeting. So yeah, all the information is available on the webpage. So in case you are interested, just go to theme webpage and to the section on seminars. And the next one, next Monday, will be also delivered by Adam and David. So if you like this one, also join the next one.
Don't run away.
And then, but following up the answer that you just gave me, then if you have, instead of a situation in which you have less water as a result of a drought, imagine that the change is structural. Don't you expect, I mean, what are the type of reaction that you will expect if you have climate change, for example, and the supply of water falls abruptly, let's say 20 years from now? Don't you expect pressures from water users to receive the same share that they were receiving before? Or is the system strong enough to continue delivering the shares that they were delivering before in a much more regular way? So less water, more frequent.
Okay. This, again, the simple answer to that is tied up in our institutional arrangements. So as in 2004, we wrote what's called the National Water Initiative. As part of the National Water Initiative, we stipulated the risk-sharing arrangements by everyone. And so climate change clearly was part of that. And it was set up so that everybody now understands how they, in a sense, suffer should the worst be realised. And the government, both state and federal, because in Australia the water is owned by the states. So we have a federal system of government, a national government, but under our constitution, the water is all owned by the individual states. So they bear some of the risk, the federal government would bear some of the risk, and the irrigators would bear some of the risk, dependent upon what happened. So in a sense there's a certainty to a degree going forward should these things become reality. The other thing I note on that is just in the news at home this last week, there was discussion about irrigators, I assume wine grape, which are rushing to Tasmania and buying up big in essentially response to fear of going to be climate change adaptation requirements, and they're heading south, where it's presumably going to be a little bit cooler still, and they may get some more water if things go bad. It's a pretty intense response, but it seems to be happening for some growers.
Okay, and the last question we're going to take because we are running out of time, 45 minutes already. Yeah. There is one person here who asks about if there is like a rule in Australia to install like kind of a water monitoring program for installing devices and how it works. That's, I guess, it's a question for one of our Italian person who's following us, because initially we are lagging a little bit behind on this. We don't have monitoring devices in all of the area. Well, actually, they are very rare to see because water used to be abundant. So they are wondering how you have decided on this, if you have a water monitoring program, if it's subsidized by the government or if it's paid by the farmers, if it's compulsory when you get a water license, or...
So is this on farm or is this system use? Very carefully monitoring the water farmers take off. We spend a lot of money underneath the base of the land to upgrade the infrastructure associated with this sort of stuff. So this is definitely a public cost up front to describe the public assets, the environmental assets, water quality is better, which of course improves everyone's outcomes. So you can see it as a public good in this regards here. So yes, we spend a lot of money doing this sort of stuff. And we'll continue to do it because the more information you have water resources, quality, the better decisions you can make in the future.
And you have cost recovery also for that? So is there any means to recover this investment from the public?
Yes, in a sense. Depending on what we're discussing, I suppose. There's so, for example, to a large degree, water use in Australia is metered. So, if you are a new farmer, or indeed if you're a continuing farmer, most of us would have experienced some costs associated with putting a meter in place if there wasn't one. So that'd be typically shared. There'd be kind of equal cost sharing. Again, I'm generalising because it's not the same everywhere, but let's say for argument, there'd be general cost sharing between the farmer and the irrigation district to implement that. And then if you've got
say a river
monitoring system,
the
the use engaging through that.
then no,
that's more
be
publicly funded,
and there won't be any
specific cost recovery, but of course it's through taxes, so everybody essentially is covering the costs.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. As I said, this was the last question. We had a lot of people taking part in this webinar today. I'm sorry I couldn't make David and Adam all the questions that you posed, but we have this time. In case you want to make the same question, because we are going to deal with a similar topic next week, it will be about drought management, drought and scarcity management in Australia. We will also talk a little bit about transferability, but it will be mostly focused on water management in Australia. But in case you want to take part, in case you want to participate and make your questions again, you will have another choice, as I say, another option, as I said, next Monday. So thank you very much to all of you for following the discussion today, the webinar today. I hope you will follow the next ICCG webinar. It won't be on water because it was the last seminar of the last webinar in the series, but well, I'm sure it will be also a very interesting topic. You're welcome to join on next Monday again if you want to continue dealing with water and to continue to learn more about water management in Australia. Just join us. So thank you very much, and until next time.